everyone. Welcome to the first of two replacement lectures for the July 16th, 2019 meeting of drugs and the international political economy. Today we're going to start working on the question of how illicit groups manage some of the central market failure challenges that confront them. In particular, in this set of lectures, we're going to talk about the problems that are posed to supply chains that work under the regime of prohibition, when they're illegal, when they have no access to state courts, when, in fact, the government is attempting to shut them down. We're going to focus today on the lack of access to state courts. In order to get here, we've made a couple of steps already in the class. One of the first things that we did was looked at the structure of these market failures. For today's lecture, we're going to be particularly interested in informational asymmetries, particularly the principal agent problem, and the collective action problem. And we're going to look at a particular set of institutional solutions that mafias or other non-state actors similar to mafias might be able to employ to manage those problems. So after we took a look at these market failure problems and their structure, we then talked about how we might use social scientific methods to test whether a particular institution was able to mitigate these problems at all. So again, we're going to be looking for variation in an independent variable, which is going to generally be the presence or absence of an institution, or the particular form that an institution takes, how closely it resembles an archetype form, and that's our independent variable. And then our dependent variable is going to be some attempt to measure whether the presence or absence of that institution makes the market failure adhere any worse or any better in that particular market. Okay, so after we took a look at how the market failures are structured and how we might test whether or not the market failures go away in the presence of a particular institution, we took a look at two non-mafia, non-crime institutions that have been used to help mitigate similar problems. First, we took a look at the state, and we took a look at several theories of where the state comes from and how it develops and consolidates political control, why it uses services, how it uses its capacity for violence in order to solve problems like the collective action problem or informational asymmetries. And then we also took a look more briefly at how corporate hierarchies, companies, businesses manage to purge these problems from their own supply chains. Well, today we are finally turning to direct examination of mafias themselves, and in order to think about how we carry out business in places that lack access to state resources or the public goods that states provide, we want to talk very briefly about what it is precisely that states provide to markets. First advantage of having a market is obviously that you have physical protection for the goods and services that you provide. Your property is secured by the violent capacity of the state. You can call the police if someone breaks into your office and steals your stuff. The second thing that's nice about having a state is that you get commercial dispute resolution. So if someone breaches a contract with your business, if someone fails to hold up their end of the bargain in a commercial relationship, you can take them to court, sue them. If you win and the state agrees that the counterparty is obligated to you under the terms of your contract, you can then borrow the state's capacity for violence in order to resolve that dispute. And because both of these things are true, we add an element of stability to business that would be lacking without it, right? If you don't know whether your property is secure, it's hard to justify investing in it. Exactly in the same way that peasants who are dealing with roving bandits might not want to grow a surplus of wheat because the bandits may come and sack it. Growing your business in the presence of arbitrary violence where there are gangs or governments or other organizations that can just take your stuff, building those businesses isn't as valuable to you because you don't know whether you're going to have the assets that you invested in the future. And then similarly, having access to commercial dispute resolution adds an element of stability into the relationships that you create. It's not absolutely life or death that you get these partnerships correct. It's still important. But if you were to be screwed over by a contracting party in a world without law, you're left completely on your own. The liability for your losses falls entirely on you. There's no way to recoup those losses. And so, in response, we theorize that businesses or people engaged in business will spend a lot of time and a lot of money making sure that the partners that they're working with are always honest and always capable of maintaining their business relationship. We can relax those costs. We don't need to spend quite as much time and energy and money vetting our business partners where we have access to lawsuits. Now, notice that the partnerships we're talking about here are not just supply chains. You can also harm sales relationships and credit markets, right? You can't borrow money to grow a business in an environment where your lender never knows whether or not you're going to pay them back, right? If the lender has the capacity to sue you and then use the state's violent capacity to actually collect the money, they will feel more secure in lending money to your business. In a world where that's not possible, it's relatively unlikely that anyone's going to lend you any money. So given these two things, what is Fryman really telling us about the logic of prohibition? What challenges do illicit businesses face above and beyond those that are faced by legal businesses? So this lecture here and the next lecture, where we cover Gambetta and Scarbeck, are going to examine how criminal and similar groups respond to this issue. Okay, to start this though, we're going to examine a case that wasn't assigned, and it's a case where the market is not illegal, but where the actors in the market don't have access to a state. And this is the case of Jewish merchants who operated in the Islamic Maghreb during the medieval period. Jewish traders were integral to economic life in the Islamic Maghreb during the medieval period in North Africa, but they faced a couple of challenges. The first is that being Jewish, they didn't have access to the Islamic courts that predominated in the region. The Islamic courts did not agree to represent them. These courts were often quasi-state. They weren't necessarily linked in with the government of the region, but they did have their own violent capacity to enforce their rulings. And the Jewish traders at this time did not have strong or predictable access to these institutions. The second problem is that, like all traders during this time, Jewish traders in the Islamic Maghreb dealt with extraordinarily long trade routes over difficult terrain. And this is during a period, of course, when travel took a long, long time. It took months to get goods from one place to another and from manufacturer to market. So let's deal with the distance first. Traders can't be everywhere. Right? If you have a business and you live in one of these little city nodes and you want to be trading or selling in a distant business or city node, what do? What's the obvious solution? Agents, right? You have agents that work in those cities. And agents, it turns out, handled a lot of the day-to-day transactions for traders that had caravans traveling to multiple cities. This allowed the traders to diversify their businesses. They didn't have to put all of their goods into a single caravan that could get ransacked. They'd lose all of their money. And it also allowed them to engage in arbitrage by being in many places at once. So you could mitigate a lot of risk. You could diversify your business by having multiple overseas agents that would receive and sell your goods to a retailer in multiple different places. So of course, what's the problem, right? We've been through our market failure game theory. The principal agent problem is our issue. What is the principal agent problem again? Well, the principal agent problem arises when a principal who can't or doesn't want to be in multiple places at once hires an agent to gain specialized knowledge about what's happening in that place with respect to the principal's business interests. Now, by virtue of gaining this specialized knowledge, the agent now has the power to act in their own interest over the interest of the agent. And we went through several examples of this during our baby game theory class. But we see in Greif's presentation here that he lays out this risk in almost exactly the same way, right? Efficiency is enhanced by letting overseas agents transact business, but when the capital was in the agent's possession, it's easy to embezzle. And it's not only easy to embezzle, it's easy to lie about where the money went, about what price you could fetch on the market if local conditions had changed, about how much of the merchandise arrived in the city in a saleable condition. All of these things are very easy for the agent to lie about, very hard for the principal to verify, right? So how do we solve this problem in the United States? If you hire someone to watch your stuff and they sell it as your own, what do? Right? I hate to beat a dead horse here, but you take them to court. We have an institution that's intended to change the payoff structure between the principal and the agent. It makes the agent's defection less profitable and therefore disincentivizes it. But this is an institution that, as we mentioned, Jews in the Islamic Maghreb lacked. So what would you happen assumes to your goods in a world in which you turn them over to an agent without a protective institution? Right, without supporting institutions, the merchants are going to be able to look down the game trees that we created in our game theory class, and they're going to anticipate this opportunistic behavior. So these exchanges aren't just going to be bad for the merchant. They're in fact not going to happen. This should remind you of an article in our informational asymmetry little subunit, right? This is a market for lemons. What Greif is worried about here, and what he thought that the Jewish traders in the Islamic Maghreb were worried about here, is that the fact that it's impossible to trust your trading partner, just like in Akerlof's market for lemons, it's impossible to trust the person you're buying the car from, doesn't just lead to bad cars being sold to good people or to good traders being ripped off by bad agents. It actually shuts down the market completely. So there's a really, really high set of stakes here. We need to come up with some institution that manages this problem. So Greif goes through the historical records, the really deep and rich historical records that Jewish traders in the Islamic Maghreb kept during these years, and finds evidence of disputes that are exactly like the principal agent problem predicts. Merchants are frustrated by their lack of legal resource, and they suspect that their agents are screwing them off. Now, in addition to this, there's the flip side of the coin. In addition to thieving agents, the distance and the imperfect monitoring capacity leads to accusations that are wrong. Here we see an excerpt from a letter that reveals two Jewish traders, disagree about whether a particular agent has cheated them. And they can't take this to court. They don't have the opportunity to investigate the agent's records, to call witnesses, and to hold the agent to account to get to the bottom of these things. So what to do? What tools or characteristics of these transactions might help the merchant solve the problem? Think back again to our lecture about the informational asymmetry. What sorts of options are available to people outside of the state? Well, one characteristic of this market is that the agent needs to work over and over and over again. That is, this principal-agent problem repeats itself over and over again. In a one-shot deal, we might have a different outcome than we do in a repeated game. And second, the traders know one another, and they write to one another. They create partnerships and dissolve partnerships, and they're constantly doing business with one another. So now, how might you predict that the merchants will solve this problem? It's medieval Yelp. Jewish traders systematically boycott agents that other traders have accused of dishonesty. Should we expect this to be a self-sustaining equilibrium? Will traders get these letters and punish their agents? Well, there's of course an incentive to defect if this is the beginning and the end of the institution, right? The traders might disagree about who's cheating them, or they might hire a cheater on purpose. Think about this for a second, right? If you have two traders and one of them wants to screw the other one over, one thing that they might do is hire a dishonest trader on purpose that helps them fleece their partner. Now you have a market for dishonest traders. Dishonest agents. And it's hard to know whether the person on the other end of the transaction is fleecing you, because an agent has an incentive to be dishonest in order to signal themselves as the type of agent that will help you profit illegally, I guess, lack for a better word, from your partnership. So we have to add something to this institution that helps solidify or mitigate against the temptation of these agents to cheat and sell themselves explicitly as cheaters to traders who would also like to cheat. So I guess this slide is just showing us that the traders actually do achieve this. And how might they achieve it? They achieve it by staking their own future participation in trade with other Maghrebi Jews on participating, right? So the way that they manage this problem is by not only boycotting agents that are dishonest, but by boycotting traders that work with agents who have been accused of dishonesty. Until those agents find some way to prove that they have done no wrong, or to prove that they have ameliorated or paid back the debt that they owe to the trader, those agents are blacklisted. And not only are the agents not allowed to work with other Jewish traders in the Maghreb, but those traders that violate the embargo against the agent are sealed off from the Jewish trade entirely. Okay, so here we have a set of institutions that were innovated by Jewish traders in the Islamic Maghreb that lacked access or stable access to Islamic courts. So a few questions that we might ask before we move on to some more explicit dealing with illicit institutions. Could we expect that reputational mechanisms might be adapted to solve problems for drug cartels? Are there limits or promises, particular promises to this approach? If you were running a drug distribution ring or a drug supply chain, how might you leverage these reputational mechanisms? Is it possible to do so? And second, what does this study suggest about what questions we should ask about market organization in the drug trade? How might we find answers to those questions? Is there an institution that can reduce inefficiency or mitigate market failures in illicit worlds that we might learn about from examining the problems that were solved in the Maghreb? Okay, so let's transition now to thinking about popular conceptions of organized crime and how those popular conceptions might mislead us into thinking that drug trafficking looks differently than it does. In popular culture and in much of what we read in sort of low-level policing public policy, we think that there's a boss. And the boss directs not only violence that's created by a mafia, but also some sort of supply chain that brings a product from its raw state through a manufacturing process and then to market. We think of organized crime as having an organization that's consistent in a way, a hierarchy that has a recognizable public face. We think of it as having a stable community, symbols and culture that bind it together in some sort of persistent organization. This has become a common belief even among law enforcement officials and lawmakers, right? These committees that were arranged in the 1950s to manage what became recognized as a growing problem that grew out of Prohibition emphasized the organizational and hierarchical nature, or the suspected organizational and hierarchical nature of criminal enterprise. This Kefauver Commission report becomes an extremely influential document that defined American and broadly Western policy response to organized crime for decades. Now notice, as Pauli does, that this allows law enforcement to racialize organized crime. One of the key things that happens as a result of the Kefauver Commission is that we start to think about organized crime not only as a hierarchy, but as a hierarchy that's dominated by ethnicity, where ethnic ties and family ties are extremely important to maintaining trust. In the next lecture for today, we'll talk through why it might be rational to organize criminal groups through ethnicity or families. But even though that's rational, Pauli argues with some convincing evidence that this allows law enforcement essentially to discriminate against races who are stereotypically seen as being, races or ethnicities that are stereotypically seen as being involved in organized crime. Even as criminologists debunked the racial aspects of crime, they stuck to this characterization of criminal enterprise as looking somehow similar to legal corporations. Why should this surprise us? Well, if organizations respond to context, if we think for a second about a research design or a research question in which our dependent variable is why do or what explains variation in how criminal groups or criminal supply chains organize, you have to admit that illegal organizations face different contexts and different challenges than legal organizations do. So we might expect that this variation in context, these array of independent variables, might have some effect on the dependent variable, the organizational structure of the criminal groups. And if criminal groups look functionally similar to corporations, we can take off the table a wide variety of theories about organizational behavior being dependent on context. In fact, those are most of the theories we have about organizational behavior. So this should strike us as being problematic. If it were true that drug cartels were organized functionally similarly to Nestle or General Motors, we should find that surprising with respect to the way we think about organizational behavior in general. How could we test this theory? How might we test the extent to which these contextual variables matter to shaping criminal organizational behavior? We might test them by doing ethnography or sociology on criminal groups, and that's a large part of how the class is going to move forward. We're going to check in on ethnographic or sociological research into these criminal organizations. We might also use economic literature or methods to check on the efficiency of corporations in illicit markets. Do corporate-like trafficking organizations perform better in illicit markets than those that are less hierarchical? And we'll take a look at studies that examine that sort of a question as well. Here's just more of a straightforward statement about the response of organizations to contexts. Illegal enterprises should emerge to meet the demand of goods or services that are outlawed, right? So in this argument, there should be no difference between conventional and criminal enterprise, because these are just enterprises that are meeting demands for goods and services. But of course, the constraints, the market constraints on these firms are vastly different. And so this kind of theory should strike you as being deeply suspicious. Here we see the UNESC is making an argument that the activities of organized criminal groups require a significant degree of cooperation and organization to provide goods and services. So there's a scientific claim being made here. What are the independent and dependent variables that the UNESC is arguing we should pay attention to? Well, the independent variable is just the need to serve customers. And the dependent variable then is the organizational structure or the industrial organization of the market itself. And so here, right, because the independent variable doesn't change, every type of business needs to serve customers, then the dependent variable shouldn't change. Nothing about the organizational structure of these groups should change. We can't explain variation with a constant, and you can't explain a constant with variation. So if our independent variable of choice is constant, we should expect that our dependent variable is constant. But these things ignore, or this theory ignores, any other contextual variables, any other limitations placed on these businesses by the market in which they operate. And what Pauli is telling us to think through here is the obvious and severe limitations that are placed upon businesses by dint of being illegal. It changes how we serve our customers pretty substantially. Here, de Klerk's is making another theoretical claim that could in principle be backed up by observations. This process has decisively influenced the way in which counter strategies took shape, right? So here, de Klerk's is arguing that detectives in Holland, the police in Holland, are responsive to theory about how organized crime works. They're responsive to their impressions about what network structure looks like. So again, what's the independent variable and dependent variable that's being argued about here in de Klerk's? Well, the independent variable is the perceptions of law enforcement, the research or popular fiction or wherever it is they get their impressions that guides them to create an understanding of what organized crime looks like. And the dependent variable is the interdiction or policing strategy that they use to confront these organizations. So we have a sales pitch from the last couple of slides that argues that we probably have our conception of what organized crime is wrong because we're ignoring massive shifts in the legal and regulatory context of the market in which drug trafficking takes place versus those markets in which legal goods are transacted. And here we have a sales pitch that getting it wrong leads us to have poor policing strategies because we think that these organizations are somehow highly hierarchical. We react in the way that we police them, and if we're wrong about the organizational structure, we're going to be wrong about the way that we police them. So again, we should be able to test de Klerk's theory in a particular way. We should be able to examine how wrong police officers are, how wrong detectives and law enforcement are about the shape or nature of organized criminal structure, and find some way to measure how efficient they are at interdiction or law enforcement against these same organizations. And what we ought to see, if de Klerk's is right, is that variation in the independent variable affects variation in the dependent variable. The closer a police organization gets to understanding how a trafficking organization works, the better they will be at interdicting. It's possible that it doesn't matter. It's possible that you just send police officers out on the street to do street rips. They grab low-level dealers, and it doesn't, as long as you're out there disrupting the organization, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong about whether this is a networked or hierarchical organization. If de Klerk's is wrong, then we should see no association between the attitudes of law enforcement toward organized criminal behavior and the results that they achieve. Okay, so here we'll just go through that a little bit more explicitly. We have an independent variable that is the perception of organized crime, which has an effect on our enforcement strategy. So we should be able to explain enforcement strategy and the success of enforcement strategy as a function of perception. We can assign values to how crime is perceived, and we can, hypothetically at least, experiment by changing the perception and watching how the perception changes policing strategy and success. De Klerk's does provide some evidence of this. Dutch police treat Dutch and foreign drugs networks differently because they perceive their structure differently. And so because they perceive of these groups differently, they should attempt to enforce against them differently. Right? Pauli suggests that there are alternatives to the overall market organization for drugs, right? So if the popular organization is wrong, we have some alternatives, right? Maybe there's just an absence of a coherent set of legal rules and sanctions, right? Maybe the exchange of illegal goods and services among actors is bound to occur only on a fragile basis. To draw some conclusions about what drug trafficking really looks like and why, how does Pauli proceed? What happens in the article? What does she do next? Well, she takes a look at several different types of possible structures that might govern Colombian drug trafficking organizations, right? Perhaps local organizers direct the activity of trusted family members or ethnic groups in multiple businesses, and they interact with each other only selectively. So in this case, each of these nodes represents a business unit in the cartel, and you'll notice that these peripheral workers in each of these networks has very little communication with anyone outside of their own network. Really, the only connections between the networks exist at the very center of that network's node. And so what we're attempting to do here is insulate, for example, this part of the network from any successful police interdiction against this part of the network, right? So we're creating some sort of a firewall between our organizations. This is the network of the 9/11 hijackers. Who's in charge here? Hopefully your answer is that it's really difficult, if not impossible, to tell. We only have a handful of nodes here in this network that have more than 2 or 3 connections to one another, or rather that have 3 connections to one another. I think that is the maximum. Oh, this guy's got 4, I guess. And relatively few of them have connections outside of the operational node in which they were working. That is to say, the number of connections between hijackers on different flights is extremely small, right? There's only one person on American Airlines Flight 77 that talks to anyone else on any of the other flights. So this is an extremely networked organization. And we think about this in deep contrast to a hierarchy, right? Here it's pretty obvious who's in charge. And it's pretty obvious that in order for anyone over here to talk to anyone over here, they need to run it up the flagpole through their organization and back down. This creates a lot of communication, even though we sense that these groups are working together through their centrally organized node. There's a lot of communication that has to happen to get a message from, for example, this worker to this worker. So we can consider then two sort of idealized ways to think about what a drug trafficking organization might look like. Here, the function of each part of the supply chain is centrally coordinated to maximize efficiency. You have some core organizer who's talking through the processing labs to the distribution cells, telling them what to expect, telling the processing lab how much demand there is, telling the distribution cells how much is coming down the pipeline. They're making sure that the farmers have the right logistics to get their products to market. These sorts of things are all being managed by a core enterprise, which endows this network with a greater deal of efficiency. They can respond much more quickly to new market challenges by communicating up and down the supply chain. That's markedly different than a supply chain with no central node, right? Schematically here, there's no central node of the supply chain. So the question that we're going to be dealing with for much of the rest of the class that hides behind a lot of what's going on in these papers is what factors influence which form a smuggling cartel chooses. We might also ask how the police should react to each type of node differently. What is the difference between these two charts in terms of interdiction? Who's in charge? If you want chaos, who do you take out? Right? Where there's a boss, this answer is pretty obvious. You take out whoever's in this core enterprise and you watch it disrupt the efficiency of how the rest of the links in the chain react to one another. Well, if your interdiction strategy has already functionally removed the center, is there anyone you can take out that creates a massive problem for this organization, especially if you believe that many of these nodes are redundant? You have multiple contacts that can fly your drug shipments from Colombia into northern Mexico, in which case interdiction against any particular pilot doesn't present much more than a hiccup. The market can fluidly respond to this change. So it's less efficient, but it's more resilient, perhaps. And these are the sorts of things we're going to look at over the course of the next few weeks. Okay, so what types of hypotheses or evidence might we look for to help make this determination? As I mentioned, Pauli provides us some evidence of this view, of this networked view, in examining the Colombian drug cartels, right? She argues that so-called Colombian drug cartels are often portrayed as multinational illegal corporations. But she argues that this is an illusion, that what's actually happening here is that there's some amount of risk-sharing cooperation that leads us to see Colombian cartels as more organized than they are. Now, in case it's not coming through from this passage or from the article, what Pauli means is that different cells of drug producers whose businesses are not related to one another, who have no connections between one another, sometimes cooperate. They bundle drug shipments together on the same plane or on the same ship. They provide mixed shipments to distribution centers in the United States or other consumption markets in order to mitigate their risk. Right? It would be highly risky if one drug producer had one distribution gang working with it in the United States. If that distribution gang gets taken out, then all of a sudden that drug production cartel has no place to sell its drugs. And so in order to diversify and mitigate this risk, Pauli notes that these drug cartels work together to create large shipments, to put together large shipments on the same plane. That doesn't mean they're working together, though. It doesn't mean that they share any sort of organizational or hierarchical structure, Pauli argues. P et al., in the consideration of, considers how street gangs are structured in California. So these are gangs in Southern California, Asian gangs in particular, that engage in a variety of organized criminal enterprise. And so P lays out a particular organizational chart for us. Here we have what are known as Dai Lo, big brothers or eldest brothers, and Dai Lo, big brothers, who run organizations that are split between what P refers to as the right and left hand. The left hand runs all of the legal money operations, those things that launder money or broker deals between legal businesses, where the right hand engages in the violence. So this gives us another sort of example of how we might organize criminal enterprise. So the description of how the gang functions is really worth looking at in depth. What happens, according to P's account, is that owners of legitimate businesses maintain contact with a number of die-die-lows, these eldest brothers, who serve as bridges between illicit and legal economies. So whenever one of the owners of the legit businesses needs something illegal, they know that they can reach out to the die-die-low. The die-die-low then acts like a general contractor. They manage a bidding process that's open to die-low from their own networks and sometimes even from other die-die-low's networks. So they essentially put out a job order for an illegal operation, and then they share in the profit with those die-lows whose gangs manage the contract. Further, the die-lows subcontractors, the ones who are actually doing the work, are specialized between different types of crime and non-crime services. So die-low become die-die-low as they gain legitimate connections directly into the world of business, and they drop their illegal service providers for legal ones. And over time, they move outside of sort of the criminal part of the group into this contracting role. So you can see that this is an immensely fluid organization, right? You have lots and lots of subcontractors, many of whom are working for multiple die-low, and the die-low are capable of bidding for illegal jobs from multiple die-die-low who have business connections into the legal market that spread out. Okay, we might also ask if there are compelling answers to mechanistic questions, right? We learned from our lecture on hierarchy that hierarchy imposes certain constraints on agents who are hoping to sell out the principle. How do networks manage this problem? If we don't have hierarchy, how do networks manage the problem of selling out? This is where we get into the question of whether it's rational for gangs to organize themselves around families or ethnicities. If you want to try and manage the problem of selling out, how can you do it without hierarchy? Well, you hook your non-hierarchical organization into a legal, social organization that does have hierarchy and that has multiple connections. So you can't screw over your family members or members of your localized ethnicity because you have to deal with these people in non-illegal business ventures all of the time. And so that binds you into being unable to act in your own best interest and then run away. You'd have to at least have some stable plan to make sure that your defection remained hidden. So we have another view here, a non-networked and a non-hierarchical view that we've already talked about a little bit and that we're going to get into in more detail in the next lecture, that sees organized crime as an arrangement about the provision of violence. This is Gambetta's state-organized model. Long-lasting groups that are hierarchical, like La Cosa Nostra or like the Yakuza, use their hierarchy not to direct supply chains, but only to direct the use of violence to protect these networks. They don't engage in the actual illicit enterprise they protect, and we'll spend a lot more time on this in the next lecture. Centralized control over violence, the state-modeled view of what a criminal group does, allows entrepreneurship in illicit spaces by providing the sorts of institutions that the state would provide. So looking at the de Klerk's and the Pauli reading, we start to get an overview of how these three models of criminal enterprise might work, right? We have a model that looks like a hierarchy, that looks like a corporation, and there are some problems that arise here, right? It's easy for the state to see those organizations. Maybe it's unrealistic to believe that there's a central operator who would take on all of the risks of communication with all the different parts of the network. We have a highly networked operation that faces massive principal agent or defection problems of exactly the sort we talked about in the Miller reading, right? Anyone in that supply chain could defect, could start to sell bad information or give bad information to their partners and use their position as a monopolist in that part of the supply chain to screw the rest of the supply chain over. And then finally, we have this state-centered or state-comparative view of how these organizations might function, which is that the hierarchy really only directs the violence. The hierarchy provides a court. The hierarchy provides the police for the underworld. It doesn't provide any sort of actual services. And so then all of your prosecutions of the agents that defect run through an outside mafia. Okay, so let's run through some information about another different type of illegal organization, one that is often associated with drug trafficking, the youth gang. So youth gangs are not necessarily created for the purpose of selling drugs, but they've oftentimes been co-opted into that business. It's a way for youth who have a lot of local information about their communities and how their communities are policed to use that information to profit by selling drugs. So we'll look at Sobel and Osaba's consideration of youth gangs. So what's the puzzle in this reading? This is a more empirical reading. It's less theoretical than Pauli or de Klerk's. What's the puzzle? What do the authors hope to explain? The puzzle, as they see it, is that gang activity rapidly expanded in the United States between the 1970s and 1990s, and they have a hard time figuring out why. Why is it that there are so many street gangs today, or at least today of the late 1990s, compared to the early 1970s? Sobel and Osaba review a handful of existing explanations. What are they? What are the explanations for gang activity? Well, the first is that gangs provide social structure for groups that are excluded from the more official social structure. So if you can't participate in politics, if you're an African American in the 1950s and you're functionally blocked from participating in regular political and economic life in the United States, you join something else, and it becomes a rebellion against the order that excludes you, which is why we have street gangs among groups that are subaltern and excluded from normal commerce. Second possible reason that we have an explosion of street gangs is that we need a corporate-like hierarchy to deal drugs. So youth gangs are popular under this theory because you can't put kids in jail for that long. That's the explanation here. The reason that we want youth gangs more than adult gangs is that the kids are more willing to take risks because they can't be put in jail for as long if they're caught. This is useful because you get less snitching. Now, the authors reject this youth-driven mechanism. They argue that there's a hypothesis that should be true if youth gangs are all about dealing drugs. What is that hypothesis? Well, if youth gangs have exploded in their popularity because they're useful for dealing drugs, because kids can't go to jail for as long, we would expect that membership in youth gangs should drop off after the kids turn 18, the age at which they can be prosecuted as adults. And a very quick look at the age range and the percentages that exist within each age range in the youth gangs that Sobel and Osaba survey lets you know right away that this is wrong, right? In fact, the majority of gang members are above the age of 18 and therefore useless if you think about this as a risk mitigation strategy against snitching. So the big pitch that the authors make here is that if either of these theories is right, what should happen? If gangs are social structures for those that are excluded and want to rebel, or if they are hierarchy for illicit commerce, we should see a particular relationship emerge. And the relationship they hypothesize is that violence should increase as gang activity increases, right? As you have more kids who are involved in social structures that are seen as a rebellion against the common order, we should see more violence. If you have gangs that are involved primarily in the sale of drugs, then we should see that violence increases as these gangs come into more and more contact and therefore conflict. So our basic hypothesis here should be that the independent variable of the number of gangs or the number of people involved in youth gangs, as it goes up, so too should the violence. There should be a positive and direct correlation between gang activity and violence. The authors argue that the prevalence of existing theories is part of why people assume that gangs cause violence, right? So because we have these strong intuitions about what gangs do, intuitions that they are going to argue are wrong, we also have a perception that gangs cause violence. And again, there's sort of this policy implication here that if we're getting what the gangs do wrong, we're going to get how to police them wrong. So what is Sobel Sobel's theory in a nutshell here. The theory is that street gangs provide protection, just like a state. Gangs arise where the state is weak. So what's the mechanism then? Who joins the gangs and why? Where gangs are joined by kids the state doesn't protect, right? There's a similar power vacuum in the drug market, right? Obviously, the state has left the drug market by refusing to regulate it. So we have sort of a similar purpose here to some extent, right? So if this is true, why do gangs arise in prisons? Right? If we expect that gangs will arise where the state is weak, why do we have so many prison gangs? What do the authors say about this? The state is weak in prisons, right? Paradoxically, the state is weak in the way that Fryman suggests, right? The state doesn't want to fully be there. It doesn't invest in governing outcomes among its inmates in the way that it might. And so the inmates have to take these things upon themselves. Prisons are dangerous places to be because even though the state is there, it refuses to regulate in a very similar way that it refuses to regulate the drug market. Okay, so if street gangs are all about protecting the unprotected, we want to test this proposition now. We want to test this proposition by thinking about the real relationship that should accrue between gang activity and violence. So we might ask where gangs should appear if this theory is true. Gangs should appear in drug markets and prisons and among underserved ethnicities. Is this where we see gangs? Typically, yes. So we've sort of got one hypothesis that falls in favor of the new theory, a very basic hypothesis. We've also argued that violence and gang activity should be correlated. We should be able to run a regression that shows an association between violence and gang activity. The problem, though, is that we expect the reverse relationship. That's very confusing language. Let me go back and amend that. If gangs provide protection to underserved minorities, what we should see, counterintuitively, is that gang activity lowers the amount of violence, right? We should see that gang activity lowers the amount of violence. In addition to this, okay, very sorry. Lost my place there for just a second. We don't see this, though, right? There's lots and lots of research that shows that there's a positive correlation between violence and gang activity in what they call the existing cross-sectional data. So why don't we give up here, right? Why don't the authors see this as disconfirming evidence of their hypothesis? Well, they argue that this could be an issue of reverse causation. Gangs come to take territory that was violent because they recognize that there's a demand for their services there. So we need to prove somehow that the violence is pre-existing, that the violence occurs before the gangs arrive, and then at some point after the gangs arrive, the violence actually recedes. So what data do the authors use for this? Well, there are two data sets. The first is 9 years of monthly gang membership data that was taken from the Los Angeles Police Department. In compiling the data, the LAPD used undercover gang intelligence officers that infiltrated the gangs in order to identify and count their members. So we have a count of the number of people who are involved in gangs in different neighborhoods. The second thing we have is violent crime data from LAPD's statistical digest. So, which is the independent variable in this theory and which is the dependent variable? Well, remember, because we're arguing that the relationship here is the opposite of the popular conception. Violence draws gangs, not gangs cause violence. The independent variable here is actually the violence, and the dependent variable is the number of gang members. But how should we measure, or when, I should say, should we measure these variables? In order to tell which comes first, we lag the data. We ask whether there's a relationship between the amount of violence yesterday and the number of gang members today, rather than correlating violence and gang members on the same day. Okay, so our independent variable is violence. Our dependent variable is gang membership. And this is the equation that they give you relating the two things. This is scary, in part because the technical demands of the test the authors run is really rigorous. But let's get to the intuition here so that as you see equations like this, you can be less scared of them. Say that we can call violence V and gang membership GM. We want to predict the number of gang members at a certain time. So this is our left-hand variable. This is what we want to know the value of, or we want to know how well we can predict that value. We start by understanding that a certain number of people in any community are just going to want to join gangs, right? If you're really savvy in your Poly 30 or Poly 5 stuff, this is what's known as the intercept of the equation. Then, and most importantly for us, we want to add the violence term. Each act of violence does some amount of work to create a new gang member. And then, of course, we have an error term. These are all the things we didn't or couldn't measure, right? So in order for the hypothesis that violence creates gang members to be true, we would need to find two things. What are those things? First, we would expect that the value of the beta here, the slope of the relationship between violence and the gang members, is positive. And remember, we're measuring the violence at time t-1 yesterday as compared to the gang membership at time t today. The way that I'm presenting this, I guess it still shows you my misspellings as opposed to when I'm up on the board. Okay, so we're doing violence yesterday and gang membership today. We expect that the value of this beta coefficient should be positive. So every act of violence has a positive impact on the number of gang members that exist today. And second, we would predict that this equation, where we include the amount of violence that happened yesterday, would do a better job of predicting the number of gang members today than this equation where we leave the violence out. Okay, so let's take a look at our results. Where do we see the stars? You'll remember from your early political science stuff that you look for results by finding the stars. That tells you where the relationship is significant. So those are the places where our hypothesized equation outperforms the null equation. Okay. So the authors say that in no case do we find that gang membership causes homicide or assault, right? Gangs do not cause violence. In this case, we tested the reverse implication, and we saw if gang members yesterday predicted violence tomorrow, and they don't. They don't. Our equation to predict gang members does not outperform, or in this case, I guess, our equation to predict violence, where we include gang members in our equation, does not outperform the equation that predicts violence where we omit the gang members. So there's no effect. On the other hand, we do see that violence appears to have a positive correlation with members, at least of certain gangs, and in particular, aggravated assault and homicide. Violent crimes seem to increase the number of gang members, or the number of members in some gangs at least. Why do the authors argue that robbery might generate a null result? With the case of robbery, our null equation, our hypothesis equation doesn't outperform our null equation. We can't really predict how many gang members there are going to be today by knowing how many robberies there were yesterday, any better than we can without this information. Well, the authors argue that the robbery data that they have is probably less good than the homicide or assault data that they have, because people don't report robberies as often, right? The police aren't going to investigate a robbery unless it gets reported. Okay, so the authors do one further test, right? There is an alternative explanation here, which is that gangs might be caused by unemployment. So if this theory is true, now we replace our violence term with an unemployment term. What was the unemployment term yesterday? Can that help us predict what gang membership will be today? Again, we expect that our beta should be positive, and that this equation will predict gang membership better than our equation with no unemployment term, and I suppose better than our equation with a violence term, right? Both of those things might be true. So the authors run this test and they determine that violence is a better predictor. As a result of violence being a better predictor, they reject the unemployment theory and say that the evidence mostly supports their idea that it's actually violence that draws people to join gangs rather than the other way around. So the policy kicker here, the thing that we think we know about what we should do about street gangs, assuming that you agree with how the evidence has been presented, is that what we really want to do is provide more rights and stable policing, better community policing to places that have gangs. And then the gangs will go away. The demand for them will elide. Okay, so to close off this lecture, we might ask ourselves what we learned about drug cartels and violence based on our examination of street gangs. And why were gangs relatively rare in the United States in the 1970s? What is the explanation there? It's an interesting potential question, right? Did policing and rights for underserved minorities somehow get worse between the 1970s and the 1990s? And if not, what's really going on under the hood here? Okay, in the next lecture, we will tackle more direct discussion of mafias. We'll cover the Gambetta and Skarbek reading, and then I will see you all on Thursday.